So I'd actually like to make one interesting observation that's not directly related to my presentation. But as many of you will know, this meeting is a continuation in our ODI Climate Finance Effectiveness series. And last week we had the initial launch event, which was much more focused on international issues around climate finance and the links with development issues. And the room was overflowing. And we definitely have a great turnout today, but the room is certainly not overflowing, and I think this in some ways reflects where the status of the international debate is. I think that the focus on climate finance, in particular the way that it's used to be effective, is still at the international global level, and I think we've not yet really begun to dig into national issues of effectiveness and even subnational and provincial issues of effectiveness. So I just think that's an interesting, it could also be that, this is a 3-hour meeting as opposed to an hour and a half, but that's just an interesting observation. So my presentation today is focused on climate finance in Indonesia. My focus is primarily at national delivery of finance focused on mitigation. Obviously quite a different focus from Marilyn's presentation in Bangladesh. Obviously country circumstances are quite different, but also the focus on mitigation as opposed to adaptation. So again, the main focus here would be on the institutional structures that are emerging to handle climate finance at the national level. Some of the key questions that we asked during the case study are, what is the current role and status of climate finance from a political and policy perspective, what types of institutional structures are emerging, and how well is finance being coordinated and aligned with national systems. So to provide an initial background of the national policy developments, first I think it's important to start to mention that we found Indonesia to be quite a useful case study for several reasons. First, Indonesia is one of the largest, I believe it's currently 4th largest greenhouse gas emitter globally. It's now leading the way as one of the first non-Annex 1, therefore non-OECD and non-developed countries to be making significant voluntary commitment to cut its national emissions. The president in 2009 committed to unilaterally reduce its emissions by 26% compared to business as usual, and if given the proper international financial support, then committed to an additional 15%, reaching the total emissions reductions to 41% by 2020. Also, Indonesia is already receiving substantial financial pledges and commitments to support its climate change responses, both by bilateral and multilateral donors, which I'll get into a bit more. And there are some very interesting new financial mechanisms that are emerging at the national level, which we thought would be very interesting to highlight in the case study. And again, this PowerPoint slide mentions some of the recent policy developments. Climate change became a major issue in 2007. Indonesia hosted the COP in Bali in 2007 and then created the National Action Plan Addressing Climate Change, referred to as the NAP, N-A-P. Also created a National Climate Change Council in 2008. In Bahasa, Indonesia is referred to as DNPI. There's a REDD Commission established under the Ministry of Forestry. Again, the president in 2009 committed to significant emissions reduction targets. And then most recently, as a result of a bilateral arrangement between Norway and Indonesia, which I'll get into more, there was a new REDD Plus working group established within the Office of the President. For those unfamiliar, just to clarify, the acronym REDD refers to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So this is just to provide a snapshot from the country interviews that we held, which is mainly from bilateral and multilateral donors operating within Indonesia at the national level, what the current financial situation is in terms of international support to address mitigation. Both committed and secured support is approximately around US dollars 4.4 billion over the next few years. This roughly breaks down into about 2.9 billion in concessional loans and 1.4 billion in grants and technical assistance. The majority, 3.5, is delivered in bilateral assistance, which is quite interesting, and around 900 million in multilateral assistance. This finance led to certainly leading to a large number of very active donors in the country. Also, a proliferation of different funding instruments that I'll get into, and the primary focus of the mitigation support is around REDD, given that the forestry and land use sector is of primary importance for Indonesia. There's also several additional pledges in the pipeline that are not included in this estimate in the chart, which is likely to add an additional several billion, and this is based on interviews with donors, but it's a bit unclear the actual figures, but the trend does look to continue at least over the next 5 years and probably beyond that as well. So what are some of the instruments that are emerging? What are the institutional structures that are emerging? I'm going to spend a bit of time on this slide because I think the details of these different mechanisms are quite important. But we've highlighted 5 main financial instruments that are being created or have been created to address climate change through international channels. The first is the Climate Change Policy Loan. This is being supported by the World Bank as well as JICA, Japan's development agency, potentially also going to be supported by the French Development Agency. It's essentially a loan it's a concessional loan to address climate change policies, and it's being directly incorporated into the country's general budget to cover its fiscal deficit. And I'll get into a bit more detail on that. Similar to Bangladesh, Indonesia has also developed a multi-donor trust fund at the national level. It's called the Indonesia Climate Change Trust Fund. Again, as the member of the audience pointed out, there's a lot of interest around these national trust funds that are being developed, I think primarily because it signifies devolution of governance and decision-making to the national level. And there's also an Indonesia Green Investment Fund that's being created. It's essentially a special purpose vehicle with some private finance support within the Ministry of Finance Government Investment Unit. There's also a Norway letter of intent. This is the bilateral agreement that I mentioned between Norway and Indonesia, specifically to provide pay for performance for REDD activities. The current pledge from Norway is to provide $1 billion between 2010 and 2016, again to provide concrete, measurable emissions reductions from REDD. And then finally, sort of a basket instrument is bilateral, multilateral project support, which is in some cases operating through national ministries, but is also operating at a provincial level to do a lot of demonstration projects, particularly around REDD. So that's kind of a lot of information, and I just wanted to highlight some of the interesting points about a few of them. I'll start with the Climate Change Policy Loan. I won't go through all of them, but the ones that I find the most interesting. To give you a bit more color what this entails, the policy loans provide, they're provided in a single tranche dispersed annually and channeled through the Ministry of Finance. It's incorporated directly into the general budget to cover fiscal deficits, as I mentioned. A very important point here is that no funds are earmarked or channeled to any specific agency or ministry. So as a result, the government agrees to a general climate change policy structure, but it repeats the policies that are already in place or already been agreed to under the National Action Plan. So there's nothing new here. It's essentially the loan does not translate into any increased financial support for any specific line ministry, and therefore no direct impact on climate change activities. So there is it's an interesting political economy situation here. I think there's some questions as to how much this loan will actually translate into significant change. I don't think that anyone's convinced that it will result in real emissions reductions. So that's the policy loan. Now with the International Climate Change Trust Fund, again, it's getting a lot of attention because of this devolved ownership, but and it's also, again, to answer the question in the audience, it is primarily under the governance and control of Bappenas, which is the national planning agency within Indonesia. So that ownership and governance has definitely been devolved. But it's at risk of being marginalized for several reasons. One, because there has not been significant donor buy-in. Currently, there's only 2 donors providing support at very small levels. DFID is one of them, positively. The other is AusAid. But as a whole, having looked at over 15 different donors' support, this results in less than 10% of the donor support going into the country. So there's clearly not enough buy-in. There is some support at the national level, but there's no sustainable sources of finance. And the projects that have so far been supported through the trust fund are very much business as usual. There's no kind of transformational change that's happening here. Certainly that support is needed, and just to give you some examples, there's studies and research being carried out around sustainable peat management. There's some capacity building and awareness raising around climate change issues. So again, this is needed support, but it's very much business as usual and not transformational. Finally, one other instrument that I want to highlight here is the Norway-Indonesia Letter of Intent. In May of last year, Norway did sign this letter of intent to provide the $1 billion to address REDD in the country. There is, basically we can separate this money. The $200 million is not dissimilar from normal ODA modalities of support, but the $800 million is being channeled to this performance-based payment, which is quite unique from traditional donor support for several reasons. One is that there is this performance-based element, so sort of a condition, if you will, attached to the finance. It also requires that a moratorium be placed on forestry concessions, which is already being negotiated. And interestingly, the level of intervention of this support is happening at a very high up level. It's not going through ministries or the Development Planning Agency, but rather within the Office of the President itself. So the REDD working task group that's been created as a result sits within the Office of the President. So the political importance of this has been heightened several steps up. I would argue that it's too early to say what the effectiveness and coordination is used as a result of this will be, but I think it will be interesting to see how this issue evolves over the next year. So within our study, we wanted to focus primarily on issues of coordination and alignment, some of which I highlighted in the previous descriptions of different funding mechanisms. I think as a result of the proliferation of these instruments, there has been, to a large extent, uncoordinated donors support leading to some level of fragmented policy. And oftentimes there is competition between government agencies in terms of the plans that they are developing. Another issue is around alignment. Some of these funding mechanisms are using parallel systems to those that are already established by the government, which is essentially can lead to undermining of government agencies. I think we can essentially point to 2 main reasons that this is happening. One is around there's different donor priorities and financing approaches. And secondly, there's, I still think, a poor understanding of what the actual activities are needed to be financed. I think there's an understanding at a very high national level of what the finance needs are, but the actual activities and implementation roots of that need is unclear. There's several lessons here. I would argue that you should all go read the report, which provides a lot more information and detail, but to highlight some, again, the needs and priorities are still not well identified. There have been national needs assessments and cost curves that have been done to highlight some of these needs, but it's quite general and not providing enough detail to really guide the financial support. We need to focus on building modalities that actually meet the needs once they are identified, rather than being guided by the modalities that are available or convenient to donors. We need to move beyond the questions of scale as a major indicator of effectiveness. I think this is particularly true for Indonesia, where the amount of financial support may not be as important compared to a country like Bangladesh. I think we need to look towards other indicators of effectiveness. How well is the political support in place? What is the capacity? What are the kind of the current perverse incentives that might be established? What's the sustainability of the support, et cetera? And move donor coordination beyond just information sharing, but actually towards combining your strategies and coordinating within government systems as well. I think increasing flexibility among donors in terms of the procurement rules, fiscal funding cycles, et cetera, would help a lot. That's kind of a very practical solution. And also increased focus on aligning funding channels and flows with national government agencies, I think, would go a long way to increasing effectiveness here. That's it from my end.
Great. Thank you very much, Jess. Again, let's open the floor to any questions of clarification on Jess's presentation. Yeah, Andy. If you could just say your name and your organisation.
Andy Norton, ODI. Jess, I was curious whether the Basket Fund allows municipalities or other local units direct access. You mentioned ministries, but not other units.
For the trust fund?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do get access to that financial support.
So municipalities can apply directly?
As well, yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi, James Eustace from the Regional Climate Change Programme for Southern Africa. Thank you very much. It was really good to hear some quite practical kind of recommendations rather than the real high-level sort of international conversations that we have. It's really interesting. My question is around the Green Investment Fund. I know you couldn't go through them all, but one of the sort of big topics at the international scale is how can these kind of instruments leverage finance from the private sector. So I was wondering if you know what the experience has been, and has that been successful, and do you think it will be successful?
I think it's still too early to say at this stage. We're still discussing it a lot, but I think from my point of view, that probably has the most kind of, I guess, momentum and hope for real change because of its engagement with private sector, and it has the ability to create real structural change in terms of energy technologies. I think there's a big focus on geothermal at this point. It's unclear what kind of impact it would have on RED at this stage, but I think in terms of the future energy technologies, it will have a big impact.
Yeah, one online.
We've got a question from Frank. He's asking that are funds for climate policy development alone, and how would an increased income allow Indonesia to pay that loan back?
It is a loan. It's a concessional loan, primarily provided by the World Bank and currently from JICA as well in Japan. I don't think there's many issues in terms of their ability to pay it back because it's been going on for about 4 years. So I think they've got a pretty good track record on repayment.
Okay. Look, join me in thanking the panel. What I'd like to do is to switch the panel around and invite our discussants external to the project to make some comments based on their experience. We're very lucky to have two